I never envisioned that the tranquil cadence of my existence could be unsettled by something so minor, so commonplace as a favor. That's how it began. Over breakfast, my husband mentioned it offhandedly, between sips of his customary black coffee, the kind he drank daily with no trace of enthusiasm. His words blended into the background, overshadowed by the clink of his spoon against the ceramic mug. It would help him find his footing, he said. He's skilled with his hands. Could mend the fence, perhaps, tend to the garage door. I nodded, agreeable. There was no reason to object. The young man in question had been part of our lives for years. His adoptive grandson, though no longer a boy in my perception, not anymore. He had matured. The last I'd seen him, he lingered in that liminal space between youth and manhood. But now, crossing our threshold with that effortless, nonchalant smile, he carried himself with the assurance of someone who knew precisely who he was. I sensed the transformation before I fully processed it. His shoulders wider, his jaw more defined, a quiet confidence in his movements that hadn't existed before. His handshake was firm, his gaze direct but not overbearing, warm, familiar, yet beneath it there was something else, a calculated ease that felt almost too intentional. My husband led him through the backyard, pointing out the faulty gate latch, the tools in the garage, discussing practicalities in that straightforward, masculine way. Unengaged beyond the task at hand, I lingered at the kitchen window, watching them. My fingers idly traced the edge of my coffee cup, a peculiar, indefinable tension settling somewhere beneath my ribs. It wasn't desire, not yet. It was awareness. That evening, as I went through the familiar motions of preparing dinner, I chose a dress I hadn't worn in months. Soft fabric, delicate straps, the kind that clings just enough to remind you of your own form. I told myself it was the heat, summer pressing heavily against the windows, the air thick and stifling, but I knew better. The three of us dined on the terrace. My husband spoke mostly of work, of an upcoming trip, another conference, more meetings, his words settling into the predictable rhythm of duties and deadlines. I listened, nodded when expected, but my gaze wandered more than once to the man seated across from me. His posture was relaxed, one arm casually slung over the back of his chair, the faintest shadow of stubble along his jaw, as if he hadn't bothered shaving that morning. His eyes met mine only once, but they lingered a fraction too long. When dinner ended, my husband excused himself to make calls. I remained outside, collecting plates, feigning ignorance of the soft footsteps approaching. As the younger man drew near, he reached for the stack of dishes in my hands. "Let me help." Our fingers brushed briefly in the exchange. A fleeting touch, unintentional, unremarkable to anyone else, but the warmth of it lingered on my skin. Long after the plates were cleared, later that night, lying beside my husband, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, I couldn't sleep. My body stirred restlessly beneath the sheets, my thoughts loud and unyielding. I rose, padding barefoot through the darkened hallway toward the kitchen, claiming I needed water. But it wasn't thirst keeping me awake. I paused by the guest room door, slightly ajar. From within came the faint hum of a careless tune, half sung under his breath as he moved about. I heard the creak of floorboards under his steps, the soft rustle of fabric, the sound of the shower starting, water striking tile. I stood rooted, listening to that ordinary private ritual, bathing, unwinding at day's end, suddenly intimate, almost intrusive, as if I were glimpsing something forbidden. Yet I didn't move, not immediately. When I finally forced myself back to bed, that same quiet tension still pulsed within me. I slid beneath the sheets beside my husband, feeling the familiar weight of his arm settling loosely over my waist as he stirred in sleep. His touch was gentle, habitual, unthinking, as it always was. But my mind lingered outside that guest room door. I told myself it was nothing, that it would fade, that I was imagining it all. Yet something had shifted. The next morning unfolded as predictably as ever. Sunlight streamed through half-open blinds, casting long slats of light across the kitchen floor. I moved through routines thoughtlessly, the kettle hissing, the soft scrape of a butter knife on toast, the refrigerator's hum as I reached for milk. My husband had left early, as usual, with a brief kiss on my cheek before the door clicked shut behind him. Routine, safe, expected. I urged myself to stop, to silence whatever had stirred the night before. I told myself I was too old for such foolishness, too sensible to let my imagination wander so freely. But my body betrayed me in subtle ways. The dress I chose that morning, the care I took with my appearance, as I tied back my hair, a hint of color on my lips. Not for anyone, I insisted, just to feel something. I found him outside, already working on the fence, sleeves rolled up, arms taut, as he drove rusted nails into place. His focus was absolute, immersed in the task, oblivious, or perhaps deliberately appearing oblivious, to my presence. Standing on the porch, watching, I noticed the sweat along his brow catch the morning light, glinting like tiny beads of glass against his skin. His movements were fluid, efficient, at ease with physical labor. I stepped toward the garden, carrying a laundry basket, with the practiced grace I'd honed over years. If he noticed the sway of my dress, the strap slipping from my shoulder, he gave no sign. But as I reached to pin the first piece of fabric to the line, I felt his gaze, not fleeting, not accidental, but steady, unapologetic, like a touch pressing lightly against my spine. I didn't turn immediately. I kept my focus on the clothespins, my pulse quickening beneath my skin. When I finally glanced his way, his expression was inscrutable, lips slightly parted as if poised to speak. "Morning's warmer than I expected," he said at last, his voice smooth, low. I nodded faintly, pretending to concentrate on my task. "It is. It could have ended there. It should have." But he didn't resume his work. He approached, his steps slow and measured across the trimmed lawn, stopping close enough that I could sense the faint heat of his body. In the space between us, he said, "You look different today." I didn't respond. I couldn't trust my voice. Instead, I reached for another pin, securing the next piece of fabric with care, my hand steady, despite the racing of my heart. A pause stretched, long enough for the moment to teeter, uncertain. "I'm sorry about last night," he said then, softer, almost tentative. If I crossed a line, I could have seized the escape, smiled politely, assured him nothing had happened. But instead, I held his gaze too long, too intentionally. "You didn't," I said, the words slipping out before I could weigh them. He stepped closer, so near I could see the faint stubble shadowing his jaw, his eyes narrowing slightly as they studied me. His hand moved, tentative at first, toward my arm, fingers grazing the bare skin of my shoulder. I didn't pull away. We stood there, the air between us heavy, with everything unspoken. Then, as if the space could no longer contain the tension, he leaned in, closing the distance with one steady motion. The kiss was not what I expected. Not desperate, not forceful, but soft, searching, a gentle press of lips against lips, asking rather than demanding. His hand rose to my jaw, thumb brushing my cheek as he tilted my face toward his. My body froze for a moment, my mind screaming warnings, but my lips parted, responding slowly, trembling. The laundry basket slipped from my hands, its soft thud against the ground, barely registering over the blood pounding in my ears. His palm slid along my neck, fingers grazing where my dress clung to my skin. I pulled back first, my breath catching, eyes wide. This can't. I managed, the words thick, clumsy. He didn't argue. He stepped back, giving me space, hands raised as if in surrender, but his gaze remained fixed, unwavering. I know, he said quietly, but it's not going to stop us from wanting it. I turned away before he could see the flush rising to my cheeks, bending to gather the scattered laundry with trembling fingers. The rest of the day blurred into routine, watering plants, wiping counters, answering my husband's call about dinner plans. I kept my voice steady, my smile intact, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt the ghost of his mouth on mine. The taste of that kiss lingered like a secret etched beneath my skin, impossible to ignore no matter how I buried it under chores, calls, polite exchanges, or daily tasks that should have filled my mind. But they didn't. They barely touched the surface. Everything within me felt unsettled, my body too aware of itself, my thoughts circling the same forbidden orbit. He acted as if nothing had happened, or pretended well enough. When our paths crossed in the house, passing in the hallway, brushing shoulders near the sink, his expression was composed, unreadable, maddeningly calm. Yet I caught him watching me sometimes, just at the edge of my vision, his gaze lingering a moment too long before turning away. There was no apology in it, no shame, only that same quiet insistence. It made me reckless, or perhaps just honest. The next night, my husband announced he'd be leaving early the next morning. Another sudden work trip, 3 days, maybe 4. His voice carried an apology, but his eyes stayed on his phone, fingers tapping out messages between bites of dinner. I smiled, nodded, said the right things. Of course, it's important. Don't worry, I'll manage. And I meant it, at least partly. But another part of me burned. That night, I lingered too long before the bathroom mirror, my fingers tracing the curve of my collarbone, noticing how my skin flushed beneath my touch. I chose a nightgown with excessive care, soft, tempting fabric, even if no one else would see it. The woman in the mirror gazed back like a stranger, someone I hadn't been in years. I didn't sleep. My body lay still, my breathing measured, listening as my husband shifted, settled into deep sleep beside me. When I could no longer bear it, I slipped from the bed, bare feet silent on the hardwood, as I crept down the hallway to the terrace, where the night air pressed cool against my flushed skin. He was already there, leaning against the railing, arms folded, his profile half illuminated by the moon's pale glow. I wondered if he'd been waiting, or if the same restlessness had drawn him out. When he heard the soft click of the door, he turned, his eyes finding me effortlessly in the dark. Neither of us spoke. I stood gripping the doorframe, as if it could anchor me against the moment's weight. His gaze dropped, tracing the outline of my body, the thin nightgown doing little to conceal the shape beneath. I should have felt shame. I should have retreated, locked the door, buried myself under the covers, and prayed for morning. Instead, I stepped closer. The distance between us closed too quickly, our bodies pulled by something neither of us could resist. He reached for me, fingers brushing my wrist, light as a question. I didn't pull away. My hand rose, resting against his jaw, feeling the roughness of stubble beneath my palm, the heat of his skin humming beneath. "I shouldn't be here," I whispered. His reply came low, steady. "But you are." The way he looked at me, not like a boy chasing a fantasy, but a man who knew exactly what he wanted, made something deep inside me twist, ache. His hand slid to the small of my back, drawing me in slowly, giving me time to stop him. I didn't. My body leaned into his, as if it belonged there, my head tilting back, lips parting before his even touched mine. The kiss was softer this time, slower, deliberate, a question asked not with words, but with the patient press of lips, the slide of his hand along my waist. He kissed me like he wanted to memorize it. Each second held, counted, and I let him. I kissed him back with the same quiet hunger, my fingers curling into his shirt, holding him close. The night around us stood still, the air thick with heat, and the scent of jasmine blooming below. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked on, indifferent to the storm brewing between our bodies. When I broke away, breathless, my hand still on his chest, he didn't pull me back. He let me go, but his eyes never left mine. "I'm not sorry," he said softly. I didn't answer. I turned, stepping back through the door, closing it with hands that trembled as if they no longer belonged to me. The next morning, everything resumed its ordinary shape. The kitchen filled with the sounds of running water, clinking dishes, the radio's low hum. My husband's suitcase waited by the door, packed for his departure. He kissed my cheek on his way out, the gesture familiar, practiced, safe. But my body remembered the night, every nerve awake, every inch alive with the echo of his mouth on mine. I knew then this wouldn't end. It was only the beginning. The morning after, the world wore its mask of normalcy so convincingly that I almost believed it myself. The sky was impossibly clear, the sun bright but gentle, the breeze soft through open windows, as if it too sought to lull me back into simplicity. Coffee steamed in its cup, toast browned just right, daily rituals playing their parts, like a well-rehearsed script. I lingered at the kitchen table longer than needed, fingers tracing slow circles around my mug's rim. The chair across from me stood empty, the air heavy with the weight of the night before. My body carried it like a hidden mark beneath the skin. That kiss, that closeness, the deliberate press of his mouth, the ache it left. I told myself it had to stop, that I can pull back, that I hadn't crossed an irretrievable line. But my body betrayed me with every thought of him, the memory of his hand on my waist, the certainty in his voice when he said he wasn't sorry. I should have been angry, disgusted with myself. But there was only the steady pulse of wanting, deep and low, as if my body had remembered how to feel. When I heard the soft creak of the back door, the quiet steps crossing the kitchen floor. I didn't lift my head immediately. I knew it was him before he spoke. His presence filled the space, even in silence. "I'm heading out to pick up materials," he said, breaking the quiet. "Need anything from town?" I shook my head, eyes fixed on the swirling patterns in my coffee. "No, I'm fine." The lie was so fragile I could barely hear the words without feeling them fracture. He didn't challenge it. He left as quietly as he came, the door closing softly, his absence almost as heavy as his presence. I spent the next hours trying to reclaim myself, folding laundry with unnecessary precision, wiping already clean counters, rearranging books on the shelf just to keep my hands busy. But nothing dulled the sharp tension humming beneath my skin. Every motion felt like a hollow imitation of normalcy, a performance I no longer believed in. By late afternoon, the house's silence was unbearable. I told myself I needed to get out, clear my head, reset. I grabbed my keys, threw on a light jacket despite the day's warmth, and drove toward the town center, eyes on the road, thoughts elsewhere. The streets were familiar, predictable, the same grocery store I'd shopped at for years, the same quiet cafe where couples sipped coffee in comfortable silence. I wandered the aisles aimlessly, fingers gliding over shelves, as if choosing cereal could anchor me back to reality. Then I saw him. Turning the corner by the produce section, there he was, at the aisle's far end, one hand on a shopping cart, head tilted as he read a jar's label. He looked up, caught my eye, and for a moment, neither of us moved. It felt too coincidental, too deliberate. My stomach tightened, my breath catching between chest and throat. He offered a half smile, easy, unruffled. "Didn't expect to see you here." I swallowed, trying to match his casual tone. Same. The space between us felt impossibly small, despite the aisle's width. We stood there, silent, pretending not to notice the electricity sparking between unspoken words. "Need a hand carrying things?" he asked after a pause, gesturing toward my empty basket, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "I'm fine," I replied, voice flatter than intended, but I didn't walk away. Instead, we moved down the next aisle together, side by side, exchanging small talk about nothing. The weather, the price of herbs, the parking lot's chaos. His hand brushed mine once as we reached for the same box of tea. Neither of us apologized. The drive home was quiet, the car filled with the engine's low hum and the unbearable tension of proximity. I felt his gaze on me as I stared out the window, pretending my pulse wasn't hammering. When we reached the house, he turned off the engine, but didn't move to open the door. "I didn't plan to run into you," he said softly. "I'm glad I did." I looked at him, really looked, and saw it. The same battle behind his eyes that burned in me. The wanting, the restraint, the painful awareness of what we were doing. "This is dangerous," I said, barely a whisper. His gaze held mine, unwavering. "I know." The moment stretched, too full. Then, slowly, he reached out, his fingers brushing my wrist, light as breath, testing if I'd pull away. I didn't. He leaned closer, eyes searching mine, waiting, giving me the choice. And again, I didn't stop him. His lips touched mine gently at first, careful, tasting like the first sip of something forbidden. But the hesitation faded. The kiss deepened, slow but certain, his hand cradling my neck as my body melted into his. When we broke apart, breathless, I pressed my forehead against his, eyes closed, heart pounding. "We shouldn't," I said. "But we will," he replied. And we both knew he was right. There was no avoiding it after that. No more excuses, no more flimsy walls of denial. Something had been set in motion, and neither of us truly tried to stop it. If anything, acknowledging it, that shared honesty, ignited the desire further, stripping away the last pretenses that had kept us cautious. My husband left early the next morning, suitcase in hand, the familiar sound of the door closing like a trigger softly pulled. The silence he left was heavier than usual, amplifying every small sound. The clock ticking, the floorboards creaking, the distant chirp of birds outside. I stood at the kitchen counter, hands wrapped around an untouched coffee cup, eyes fixed on the steam curling upward, as if I could lose myself in it long enough to forget the weight in my chest. But I couldn't. My body was awake in ways it hadn't been in years, restless, sensitive, aching beneath the surface. When I heard the faint knock at the back door, I didn't hesitate. I didn't need to look. I felt him there before I saw him. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, closing the door softly. His eyes found me instantly, reading the conflict I hadn't hidden. I felt heat rising beneath my skin as he approached, the space between us vanishing in a few steps. Neither of us spoke. His hand lifted, fingers grazing my face, sliding back into my hair as he watched me carefully. There was no aggression in his touch, only certainty. His thumb traced my jaw, a gentle pressure both patient and possessive. The kiss came quickly this time, without the cautious build of before. His mouth met mine with a hunger that matched my own, his hands sliding to my waist, pulling me into him as if we'd spent years denying this. And perhaps we had, in every glance we'd ignored, every moment we'd pretended not to feel what was already there. I don't recall reaching for him, but my hands were in his hair, fingers tightening as I leaned into the kiss, tasting the mix of urgency and restraint that made stopping impossible. My heart pounded so hard, I thought he must feel it. He pressed me gently against the counter, one hand steady at my back, the other on my hip, holding me as if I might slip away. I didn't resist. My body leaned into his, eager, trembling, desperate for his warmth, his weight, the pull of his mouth. It wasn't rough or careless, every touch deliberate, slow enough to make me ache, fast enough to set my skin alight. When his lips left mine, trailing down my throat, I gasped, my head tipping back, fingers still tangled in his hair. His breath was hot against my skin, his mouth soft but insistent along the curve of my neck. "I can't stop," he murmured, voice ragged. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind had quieted, my body speaking a language I'd long silenced. It wasn't the first time my husband had left me alone in this house, nor the first time I'd felt loneliness press into the spaces he didn't fill. But this was the first time I'd let someone else reach into that void and claim it. The world outside remained unchanged, the garden swaying in the breeze, traffic a faint hum beyond the hedges, the sky wide and cloudless, indifferent. But inside, Everything felt different, alive, dangerous. When he stepped back, chest heaving, hands still at my waist, his eyes locked on mine. Neither of us spoke for a long moment, the air charged with the choice we'd made. "You know this isn't going to be enough," he said finally, voice steady. I nodded slowly, fingers brushing the countertop as if needing something solid to ground me. He was right. A kiss, a stolen moment in the kitchen, would never suffice. The wanting had rooted too deeply. As he turned to leave, I watched the curve of his back, his shoulders squared as if bracing against what we'd done. He didn't look back. I stood there long after the door closed, my body humming with the echo of his touch, my lips still swollen from his mouth. I should have felt regret, but all I felt was unbearable hunger for the next time. I woke the next morning with his taste lingering between my lips and memory, like a bruise felt with every breath. Sunlight spilled across the bedroom floor in soft lines, casting familiar patterns on the walls. But the room felt altered, as if it held a secret I couldn't tuck away between folded sheets and half-empty drawers. There was no use pretending, not to myself, not anymore. The line had been crossed, not by accident, but with eyes wide open. What scared me wasn't the guilt I was supposed to feel, but the hunger that sharpened with each moment. I replayed his hands on my skin, his breath warm against my neck, the roughness of his stubble as his lips sought more. I moved through the house slowly that morning, touching furniture as if it belonged to someone else. The counter where my back had arched under his grip, the chair he'd sat in, calm as still water, as if we hadn't unraveled in the dawn's soft light. Every corner felt marked, though no visible signs remained. The walls seemed to have absorbed the heat of it all, radiating it back at me. I busied myself with cleaning, moving objects needlessly, wiping spotless surfaces. Each motion was mechanical, a futile attempt to mute the tension rising beneath my ribs, but no distraction could silence it. Every touch of my own hands, folding clothes, brushing hair from my face, awakened the places his fingers had been. By midday, the house was too still, the silence pressing against my ears. I knew I wouldn't last the afternoon, pacing between walls that only reminded me of him. I told myself I needed air, needed to get out, even for an hour. The decision felt innocent as I grabbed my keys, pulling a sweater loosely over my shoulders, slipping on flats by the door. But stepping outside, my heart quickened with the dangerous possibility of seeing him again. A game of chance that no longer felt accidental. I drove aimlessly at first, the engine's hum filling the quiet. The town's streets blurred past in familiar shapes, but my mind was elsewhere, on the weight of his gaze, the certainty in his hands, the sound of his breath thick with need. I felt the pulse of it low in my belly, a craving I could neither name nor satisfy alone. I pulled into the parking lot of a small convenience store on the town's edge, a place I knew he sometimes visited, where our paths might cross just plausibly enough to pass for coincidence. I told myself I needed milk, bread, a mindless errand, but my eyes scanned the lot before I turned off the engine, searching for his car. It wasn't there. I should have felt relief, but disappointment ached heavily. Inside, I wandered the aisles slowly, barely noticing what my hands picked up, my body disconnected from my thoughts. Turning down the next aisle, there he was. Not at the counter, not outside, but by the cooler, one hand braced against the metal door, the other tucked into his pocket. His head turned at my footsteps, eyes locking onto mine with the ease of someone waiting, or hoping. I couldn't tell which. For a moment, neither of us moved. I reached for a carton of milk, fingers too steady for my racing heart. His gaze followed, slow, deliberate. You following me now? His voice was soft, teasing. I shook my head, the corners of my mouth lifting before I could stop them. Not intentionally. The space between us felt suffocating, even with the cool air from the fridge brushing my skin. I turned slightly, pretending to study drink labels, but I felt the heat of his eyes settle against my back like a hand pressing down. You're not wearing your ring, he said quietly. I froze for a half second, glancing at my bare hand, where I'd slipped off the ring that morning without thinking, leaving it in the dish by the sink where I kept it at night. I didn't answer. The silence thickened, heavy with unspoken truths, hanging undeniably between us. He stepped closer, his movement casual but certain, close enough that I caught the faint trace of his cologne beneath the clean scent of soap. My body tensed, breath catching. Do you want me to stop? His question hung there, soft but steady. I could have said yes, should have, but my lips parted, and nothing came. Instead, I felt his hand brush the small of my back, fingers trailing upward to my shoulder, his thumb moving slowly along the edge of my sweater, eyes locked on mine, waiting for protest. There was none. When I exhaled, it was shaky, uneven, my body leaning slightly toward his touch like a moth to flame. We didn't kiss, not there, not in the open where anyone could see. But the tension wrapped tight, pulling our bodies forward in silent agreement. The drive home felt endless, every stoplight and turn a reminder of the choice I hadn't made, or had made long before admitting it. I spent the evening pacing between rooms, restless, unable to settle. My body craved the heat of his hands, the firmness of his grip, the weight of his mouth. But more, I craved how he looked at me, as if I were still alive beneath the layers of habit and compromise. When his message came, short and direct, "Are you alone?" I didn't hesitate before typing back the only word that felt true. Yes. Even before he knocked, I was waiting. The knock was soft, almost polite, as if its gentleness could lessen the weight of what waited on the other side. But it didn't. My hands trembled against the smooth wood as I reached for the handle, fingers curling tightly, willing myself to breathe evenly. I knew who it was the moment my phone had vibrated, the single line of text glowing like an invitation too deep to refuse. When I opened the door, he stood there, one hand in his jeans pocket, the other resting against the frame, leaning slightly, gaze steady. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The space between us crackled like a live wire, the air thick with anticipation humming beneath the skin. I stepped aside wordlessly, letting him cross the threshold. His eyes moved over me slowly, pausing at the loose knot of my hair, the thin straps of the top I'd chosen so carelessly, yet so deliberately. My body responded before my mind could catch up. A tightening low in my belly, warmth blooming across my chest as if my skin remembered his hands. I closed the door quietly. Neither of us spoke. The seconds stretched, unbearable, until he moved toward me, closing the space with measured steps. His hand reached out, fingers brushing my collarbone, trailing up to the curve of my neck. I tilted my head back slightly, involuntarily, his touch igniting something I could no longer smother. "I shouldn't be here," he said, voice slow, but his hand didn't leave me. "I know," I answered. Then I stepped forward, closing the illusory gap, my body pressing into his, as if drawn by gravity. His mouth found mine with a hunger both familiar and desperate, lips firm, fingers threading into my hair as he deepened the kiss. There was no hesitation now, no careful pacing, only need. The kiss was bolder, heavier, carrying every lingered glance, every stolen breath we'd pretended was innocent. His hands moved down my back, pulling me closer, holding me as if I might vanish. I leaned into him, my body softening, surrendering to the pull I'd fought so uselessly. The warmth of his breath against my cheek, the solid line of his chest, the slow slide of his palm along my waist. It unraveled me, piece by piece. When he broke the kiss, his forehead rested against mine, our breaths shallow, tangled. "This doesn't feel wrong," he whispered, and I hated how much I agreed. We stood suspended in the house's quiet. The only sounds, our unsteady breathing and the soft tick of the hallway clock, counting seconds we could no longer ignore. "I can't stop wanting you," he said, his voice cracking slightly. My hand lifted, fingers grazing his jaw, tracing its curve. My lips parted, but the words were too heavy to form. What could I say that wouldn't sound like an excuse? What explanation could justify this hunger rooted so deep? The truth was, I didn't want to stop either. I'd spent years believing wanting had an expiration date, that marriage meant the end of that quiet burn beneath the skin. But here it was, alive and sharp, reminding me with every touch that I was still capable of desire. Not the polite affection I'd accepted, but raw, urgent, undeniable. We moved to the living room almost without thinking, hands never leaving each other, bodies drawn by everything we weren't saying. The couch offered no resistance as I sank onto it, pulling him with me, his weight pressing me into the cushions, his mouth finding the soft space beneath my ear. His fingers traced my shoulder, slipping the strap of my top down slowly, carefully, as if unwrapping something delicate, dangerous. My skin shivered beneath his touch, my body arching into him, craving more. But just as the heat threatened to spill into something unstoppable, he paused, pulling back to meet my eyes. "Tell me to go," he whispered. I stared at him, chest rising and falling fast beneath the thin fabric, lips swollen from his kiss. My heart thundered, guilt and wanting tearing me apart. But I couldn't say the words. Instead, my hand curled around his shirt, pulling him back, my mouth finding his with all the certainty I couldn't voice. The night closed around us, the house's walls silent witnesses to the choice we made repeatedly without speaking it. There was no plan, no future discussed, only the unbearable need of the moment, the feel of his body against mine, the taste of him on my tongue, the heat of his hands exploring skin I'd nearly forgotten could feel so alive. When he left, long after the moon had risen high, his absence pressed into the room as sharply as his presence had. I lay awake for hours, sheets tangled around my legs, body trembling with the memory of his touch. The guilt I expected never came, only the unbearable ache of knowing I'd let it happen again. because I didn't want it to stop. I wish I could say reason overtook me after that night, that the weight of my actions crushed me with guilt, that shame wrapped so tightly around my throat. I had no choice but to confess, run, or fight the wanting. But that's not what happened. What happened was worse. What happened was hunger. Desire has its own logic, timing, rules. Once it takes hold, finding your weakest point, it doesn't relent. It doesn't care about rings or years spent sharing a table and bed. It doesn't ask permission, just waits, patient, certain, ravenous. I performed the ordinary with exhausting effort in the days that followed. I smiled when expected, answered calls, replied to my husband's messages as if my hands weren't still burning with another's touch. His voice over the phone was kind, familiar, full of the soft attention I'd known for years. He spoke of meetings, colleagues, a dinner he couldn't refuse. His words painted our life, safe, predictable, intact. I responded as always, voice steady, replies automatic. But beneath, something pulled at the threads of that neat fabric, unraveling it silently. The house felt emptier, though it had always been this quiet when he was away. But I had changed, or perhaps admitted something long buried. I began noticing myself again, the clothes I chose each morning, my hands lingering on silk blouses, lace underthings I hadn't worn in months. Not for my husband, not even for the man I shouldn't have touched, but for the version of myself I thought had vanished, the woman who wanted to feel desirable, awake. When I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror, I didn't look away quickly. I let my eyes trace the lines time had etched across my face, the curve of my lips, the bare skin of my shoulders. I stood there longer than needed, adjusting my dress's neckline, watching the fabric cling to the shape beneath. The days blurred, marked by small tasks and the heavy ache of waiting. Every sound outside sent my heart leaping, every creak tightening something in my stomach. I didn't know if he'd come again. I didn't ask, but when the soft knock came at the back door, I wasn't surprised. I opened it without hesitation. He stood there, not leaning casually this time, not hiding behind practiced calm. His hands were in his pockets, gaze direct, unflinching. "I shouldn't be here," he said again. I could have echoed the words, repeated the warnings we both knew were empty. But I didn't. I stepped aside. He moved past me slowly, as if waiting for me to change my mind, to close the door and end this before it grew beyond control. But I didn't close the door. I followed him into the kitchen, where the air felt heavier, the charged silence wrapping around us like a second skin. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed loosely, watching him hover, unsure how close he could get, unsure if I'd allow it. He stood still, searching my face for something I didn't know how to give. A sign, permission, an invitation. I offered nothing, only the quiet curve of my body, lips parted just enough to let breath slip out slowly, eyes locked on his. It was enough. He crossed the space, his hand lifting, fingers brushing my cheek, before sliding into my hair, gripping just tight enough to pull my face toward his. The kiss came hard, fast, his lips crashing into mine with the weight of every hour spent waiting. I tasted the urgency on his tongue, felt the hunger in how his body pressed against mine, pinning me between the counter and his chest. I gave in completely, hands on his shoulders, fingers curling into his shirt, pulling him closer, needing more. There was no careful pacing, no tentative touches, only the raw ache of two people who knew they shouldn't and did anyway. His mouth trailed down my neck, teeth grazing lightly beneath my ear, making me gasp, my body arching into his. His hands found the small of my back, slipped beneath my blouse, warm and firm against my skin. We moved to the living room without words, bodies tangled, hands roaming freely, lips breaking apart only for a breath. The couch caught us again, my back against the cushions, his weight grounding me, stripping away the last of my hesitation. But then he paused, pulled back just enough to look down at me, breath heavy, eyes searching. "We're not going to stop, are we?" His voice was rough, thick with the fight between restraint and desire. I didn't answer. I reached up, fingers brushing his jaw, pulling him back, my mouth finding his again. The truth didn't need words. We were past pretending. As the night folded around us, as his hands memorized my shape, I stopped asking if this was right or wrong. I knew it was inevitable. By the time my husband returned, the house had learned to keep my secret. The walls held the silence as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't witnessed the slow tearing apart of the life I'd built. The kitchen was clean, the bed made, the laundry folded neatly in drawers. My hands moved through routines with mechanical precision, my body performing the gestures of a woman whose life was still intact. But I was not intact. Some betrayals are quiet. No slammed doors, no raised voices, no objects hurled in anger. Some slip beneath the surface like a slow leak, unnoticed until the floor beneath you rots away. I thought I'd feel it. The crushing guilt, the shame that's supposed to follow like a shadow. But guilt, I learned, isn't always loud. Sometimes it wears the face of longing. Sometimes it tastes like the mouth of someone you should never have kissed. He kept his distance for 2 days after that last night. I didn't see him, didn't hear the knock, but I felt him everywhere, in the way I stared out the kitchen window too long, waiting for a shadow to pass, in how my skin burned where his hands had held me, tracing paths not yet faded from memory. When my husband walked through the door, suitcase in hand, his smile was the same soft curve I'd seen countless times. Familiar, kind, safe. He kissed my cheek, lips warm but lacking hunger, and asked about the house, the garden, the small details that always filled our conversations. I answered as always, voice even, smile polite. But part of me stood outside myself, watching the scene like a stranger, watching the woman who'd once been certain of her boundaries, now nodding as if she hadn't burned them to ash. At dinner, I listened as he spoke of the conference, colleagues, deals that went well or didn't. His words filled the air between bites of roasted chicken and sips of the same dry, reliable wine he always chose. Like him, I smiled when expected, laughed at the right moments, touched his hand across the table, the gesture smooth, practiced, effortless. But my thoughts wandered to stronger hands, a mouth that kissed with intent. That night, in the quiet of our shared bed, his touch was gentle, patient, as always. But my body didn't respond. I lay beneath him, eyes closed, hands resting loosely at his sides, my mind elsewhere, my skin waiting for a spark that didn't come. I knew how to play the part, how to make the right sounds, arch my back just enough, finish the performance without breaking character. But I felt nothing. Or worse, I felt the memory of someone else. When it was over, he kissed my shoulder softly, whispered that he'd missed me. I closed my eyes tighter, swallowing the ache in my throat. I wondered if he sensed it, the absence beneath my skin where love had once lived. The next morning, I moved through the motions again. Breakfast, dishes, errands I told myself were necessary. I watched him leave for the office, briefcase swinging lightly, back straight, shoulders squared, trusting. As the door closed, my breath caught in my chest. I don't know if I'd been waiting for the message or if I'd already written it in my mind before it reached my phone. Are you free? The answer was already there, beneath my fingertips, before I could argue with myself. Come. The knock came faster than expected, as if he hadn't been far, as if he knew the door I'd left open for him. When I let him in, there were no words, only the steady pull of bodies that had chosen each other long before permission was granted. His hands found me easily, as if by instinct. My body answered before my mind could intervene. But this time, something was different. When he held my face between his palms, when his lips pressed against mine with that same aching need, there was no rush, no frantic tearing of clothes, no desperate grabbing. There was patience, care, and that made it worse, because it felt like something more. I felt it in how his fingers lingered at my jaw, tracing slowly as if memorizing it. In the softness of his mouth against my throat, the weight of his body pressing without urgency, as if we had all the time in the world. And I hated it, because wanting him was one thing, needing him another. But this tenderness, this dangerous sweetness, felt like the start of something neither of us had the right to claim. When we finished, lying tangled in the soft aftermath, his hand rested lightly on my hip, thumb moving in slow, absent circles against my skin. We can't keep doing this, I said at last, voice barely above a breath. He didn't argue, didn't offer promises or excuses. He only nodded, eyes closed, forehead resting against my shoulder. But neither of us moved. In that stillness, I understood what terrified me most. It wasn't the guilt. It was that I no longer wanted to stop.